everyone. Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters. With your questers, Josh and Dan, I am Dan.
I am Josh.
And on today's podcast, we will be discussing all things nautical once again, because we're going to go through episode 3 of our Serpent River deep dive onto House Syrtis.
Deep dive.
Puns. I'm very full of puns. So if you have any questions for us about anything, please contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. But first, we have a couple of emails to get through, so we are going to talk about a few things quizzical. So we're going to handle Josh's brain fog and see what we can pick out of this here like little nits. This one comes from K. Scott Rowe. Hey, Dan and Josh. Still loving the podcast. Still. That's a good thing. I like
Good to
that.
hear.
I hope you are enjoying it too. We have our days. I'm kidding. We actually are enjoying this immensely.
We're still doing it, so we must.
Josh is forcing me. I'm kidding. My players are working through a module which I won't name because of spoilers. While preparing for this module, I came up with a couple of questions. 1. The climbing talent reads that movement is either up or down, but a character can move laterally, and if so, by how much? For example, imagine a character needs to cross a lava pit inside a stone room. Could they climb the side wall laterally to get to the other side? Or should this ability be left to a climbing knack?
I don't think there's anything wrong with allowing lateral movement with the climbing talent, and I would use the same movement rate that the talent normally provides.
Yeah, it's just being careful not to fall off. So I think rock climbers will weigh in on this one a whole lot more than me. But I agree entirely because it's... Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be something that would require the development of a knack.
Yeah, that's not going to break the game. Sorry.
It's not a problem.
Go, proceed, as you will. Question number 2. The third circle wizard spell, Levitate, reads that a 2-yard radius of force is what actually raises or lowers characters and objects. Is this radius adjustable? For example, could a wizard raise or lower someone in a well that has a radius less than 2 yards?
I would say yes. I didn't look at the actual spell description. Hold on. Levitate. Extra threads can increase the area of effect, or the radius of the platform. I would say that, yes, if you wanted to decrease the amount of space that it covers, I would certainly allow that in a game.
And alteration requires the extra thread. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if somebody wanted to reduce the area that it covered, that I would require the extra thread. I mean, obviously, if you wanted to increase it, then you need that because that's in the rules as written. But I wouldn't have a problem. Oh, I want to levitate somebody out of this well.
Too narrow.
Sorry, the well is too small, so your levitate platform isn't going to work.
That's just being persnickety and a dick move.
Yeah,
I'm going to go with that.
Again, in a game that I was running, I would allow that.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a major plot point in my view, but that's just me. As it happens, my players skipped both of these portions of the module, so my questions are now purely academic. Thanks, K. Scott.
They're good questions.
Made me laugh. We're all good there. All right, following. This one's from Ben. Hi, chaps. I'm wondering if I should put an accent behind this now, and I'm going to skip that part.
No, don't.
Josh hates it when I do that.
I don't hate it, but it's not necessary.
It's not necessary, no. I really wanted to email you guys to say how much I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. Accents or not. I discovered it about 8 weeks ago and have been blitzing it every day, either on my way to or from work, while I'm walking the dog or painting my minis. It's really stoked me up to read more of the Earthdawn lore and weave it into my game. I've especially enjoyed listening to Dan recite the Legends stories and Josh's one-shot Tales from the Omniverse. I've had a game running with my group for a year or so now, and they're currently at 4th and 5th circle after working their way up from 1st. Rightfully so. I've based my game in the Wastes and redesigned a lot of the pre-gen monsters, giving them a Wastes mask. Will you be producing any further material on the Wastes? Also, I'd love to hear a podcast of one of your games, Dan, or maybe a game where both of you are involved. Anyway, keep this going as long as you can. Regards, Ben from across the pond in London.
Thank you, Ben. There is not currently anything planned or in development to do more about the Wastes. No particular reason for it. It's one of those areas that, rather than having a dedicated book, I mean, it's already got some info on it in the Elven Nations source book. but it would be something that either gets little bits of lore from creature descriptions or things like that out of that area, or horrors or something like that. Or if an adventure gets produced that is set in or has the wastes as part of it, then there might be more information there. But that's the only thing that I can think of where more information on that might be created.
Fair. And I don't think you're going to find Josh and I playing in any Earthdawn campaigns together anytime soon. Finding time.
Yeah, it's a time issue. I'm not playing or running in an Earthdawn game currently because I've got other stuff that I've got to do and life and all of that.
Yeah, mine, I think we only play bi-weekly. I'm only able to play once a month until January. So I hit my October. I only got 2 more sessions until January, so I gotta eke those out. But otherwise, yes, my group is not the prettiest. We shouldn't be on YouTube at all. So I guarantee. One of those things. Next, we have an email from, I think, a new listener, Saint Bless. Hello, Josh and Dan. Great podcast show, great energy, and I love the spirits in the 4th Earthdawn edition. Seriously, who thinks of this stuff? Great work.
To answer that, it is mostly Morgan. The spirit descriptions and whatnot were him running with the notion that I had of doing more for spirits in terms of personality and descriptions and style, rather than just having them as modifiable stat blocks.
Fair enough. So a collaborative effort from Josh and Morgan.
Yes.
Questions for the podcast show. Is the great dragon Janari Maker the great dragon Elfbane's brother? Okay, hang on. Janari Maker is something I've never heard of.
Okay, this is a deep cut. Janari Maker is referenced exactly one time in the Theran Empire sourcebook. In the Vasgothia chapter, the narrator of a section or of that whole chapter is captured by Earthswallower, a dragon in that area, and then is given an errand to travel to Marak, quote, with a message for someone she called Janari Maker. That's it. That's the reference. It's not actually clear that Janari Maker is a great dragon. I mean, it's a fair assumption to make, but given that Janari Maker is in Marak, I do not think that it is Elfbane's brother. I imagine that that's thinking of Lofwyr, because Elfbane is Alame's, people have been looking for Lofwyr in Earthdawn since Alame's was described. No, Janari Maker, as far as I am aware and concerned, is not Elfbane's brother, Alame's brother, Lofwyr, or any other relation to them as far as I can tell. But that's the only reference, and that's it. And I say no, but
if you want it to be,
beyond
it's
that,
your game. Go for it. Second question. For elves, blood elves, that take the great dragon Icewing's life-extending potion that King Varulus got during the Scourge, would that make them great elves?
No, because the great elves do not have the way that they are because of the potion.
Fair.
We're not sure I'm not sure the exact mechanism. It's not something that's ever been revealed, but the fact that the dragons did something with them, it is presumed that the immortal elves are dragonkin and that they are immortal because of that, but there could potentially have been some other dragon thing that was done to them, but it is one that is transferable. It is something that can be inherited, and it might be something that needs to be activated in particular magical circumstances, but it doesn't have anything to do with the potion that Icewing gave to the Varulus clan prior to the Scourge.
All right, number 3. Would the spell matrix talent that is optional for familiars, oath ritual, that is between an ally spirit and its master, be shared or shareable? So the spell matrix talent, would that be shareable?
Right. So this is sort of a 1st edition reference because we haven't updated familiars to 4th edition. They are on the slate of for possible inclusion in Deeper Secrets when that is wrapped up. That will depend in part on space available. I'd like to see it in there, but ultimately that's down to Morgan because he's the lead on that book, and page counts are a thing. So going by the 1st edition rules, which is where the spirit familiar is a matrix thing comes from. I'm not sure what he means by shareable. Like that's a term that I don't recognize. Is that something that you mean that like could be shared, that either the magician or the spirit could use the spell within it? I don't know. I'm not clear on what the question is actually asking by it being shareable. It's possible because of a later question that he sent in that he might be referring to the share spell that is available to wizards, where you can give somebody use of one of your spell matrices, and he might be asking if you could use that spell to share the matrix that's in the spirit with somebody else, rather than it being limited to one of your actual, one of your standard regular matrix talents. If that's the case, my reaction would be, I don't see why not, but the spirit might not be particularly happy with it, but it's not something that I would say by the rules as I interpret them from first edition would be prohibited at all, because that matrix is raised and otherwise treated as the spell matrix talent.
I got nothing on you, because that sounds overly complex.
Yeah, and if the question is just asking, could the spirit cast the spell out of it? Spirits don't use spell matrices.
Yeah.
If they have spell casting ability, they don't need to use matrices. So that's kind of a moot point.
Okay. Thank you, one and all, for emailing us. First time, second time, fifth time, I don't care. Please keep them coming. So feel free to reach us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And now,
I do want to say one other thing real quickly.
Yeah.
Stefan, Saint Blessed, sent us like 5 emails. Appreciate the enthusiasm. A lot of the stuff that's in there is just, hey, here are my characters. I think he's looking for a game group. Check out the links in the show notes for the West Marches. If that's something that you can get into, that's a sort of drop-in kind of availability scheduling thing for people. But yeah, a lot of those emails, it was kind of great to look at them, but it's not, we're not going to read all of that stuff. That would be like an entire episode just on its own because of the amount of stuff that was sent. It was cool, but we've only got so much time.
Appreciate the enthusiasm. Keep them coming. When something's airworthy, we'll get to it. So on to House Syrtis. And this is the House of the Dragon Moon. Their usual symbol is the silver dragon on a blue field. So if they fly a flag or have a tattoo, this is pretty much it. This is the oldest aropagoi, honored center, and has ruled the mid-reach for millennia and on. This also dominates this stretch of the river. And we're talking a huge stretch of the river. House Syrtis is basically just north of Tansiyarda, along where the cross-section of the Aladar River hits the Serpent River, and it goes all the way north around north of the Thrall Mountains and onto Caer Eidolon. And I think it even goes further west than that, doesn't it?
Generally speaking, at this point in time, Eidolon is considered the most upstream section of the river that House Syrtis controls. The area between Eidolon and Lake Vors is contested between Syrtis and Ishkarat at this point. But yeah, more or less from where the Serpent flows into Lake Ban up through the Lalai Gorge and all the way around, that's the mid-reach of the Serpent and is considered House Syrtis territory.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is House Syrtis is only slightly younger than the establishment of the Elven Court, to give anybody any idea how old House Syrtis is. This was founded by a bunch of Tiskrang villages of the Lalai Gorge. They all banded together, and this is a very long legend. If you have the Serpent River source book, this is a very long legend of the courtship of Sinope, which led to Ypandal giving the Tiskrang the fire engine.
Yeah.
So the founding of House Syrtis is based upon Ypandal and the fire engines themselves. So again, they are monumentally important in Tiskrang culture and so forth.
Yeah. In the Serpent River book, it's a good two pages plus a little bit.
Yeah, and then we're talking 8.5 by 11. It's a read.
It's like four columns and a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it involves the passions and whatnot. I actually have not read this in quite some time. And there are cases where these like really old stories and legends can potentially be gleaned for clues as to what might have actually happened in those ancient sort of forgotten times.
Yeah.
Even sort of prehistoric from an Earthdawn point of view, because it goes on to explain that while the Tiskrang of House Syrtis kind of loom very large in the cultural mythology of the Tiskrang, their actual recorded history is nowhere near as illustrious.
It never is. You turn over the rocks, you find some things crawling around. Speaking of, let's go back to their pre-Scourge history, because we were talking about the foundation of this based upon the legend of Sinope. Their pre-Scourge history is that House Syrtis was kind of divided and ramshackle, as you are before you coalesce into an actual house. And 2 of their 8 Nials allied with Thera. Yes! And slavery was there as well. But the Shivalahala at that time assembled the council of the Lahalas, and together they asked the 12 riddles to the dragons about how to survive the Scourge more than just what was in the rites of protection and passage from Thera. So they didn't want to build an underground care either. They really wanted to be, to Scrang. And so they learned at this point how the council therefore published the addendum about hibernating through it. And so House Syrtis is, I can't say how, but really instrumental in the Tiskrang survivability of the Scourge.
Yeah. One of the key features of House Syrtis is that while they are sort of very old and were established by, as was the case with both the Katention and Vistriman aropagoi as well, the alliance of nearby, Tiskrang villages that were nearby each other, House Syrtis apparently has this long-standing history of the various noble houses amongst them of feuding and intersinine squabbles and whatnot, that while they are sort of united as an aropagoi, the different houses like to try and one-up each other and gain advantages and stuff like that. And so what was really kind of going on with regards to the 2 of the foundations that kind of supported Theran slaving were sort of like punitive slaving raids against the elves of Wormwood and that area up there because of the long-standing rivalry between the elves and the Tiskrang, which we talked about a little bit back in the Vistriman episode.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of that sort of piracy and whatnot that was going on, and the Orichalcum Wars just in general was a case of everybody kind of fighting and taking advantage, doing what they could to try and take advantage of other powers in the area, and the Therans kind of let it happen as long as it didn't interfere with the flow of resources to the Empire.
Yeah.
But House Syrtis was involved in the thing that resulted in the hibernation ritual that was added on to the rites of protection and passage.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of like a whole thing.
Totally. The interesting thing about the actual Scourge history is that the Horrors took a special interest in the Cliff City, which is where House Syrtis is basically home base, essentially. It's their foundation. The Shivalahala personally fought off 6 different horror breaches, fought 6 different horrors, of course, died every single time and passed on their memories to the new Shivalahala, because that's how you do it. Kind of like the Vulcan mind meld, and that's the hand-waving I'm going to do on how that actually works, because Josh has infinitely more information about how that actually works. But because she died all 6 times...
it's not clear that she died each time.
Fair.
What happened is that the Shivalahala was fighting off horrors, and the results of that did end up killing her. and sort of impressed these psychological scars on her.
Oh, yeah.
And resulted in this kind of mental fracturing that was because of the memories that get passed on through the Lahala lines that were sort of getting passed on to her successors post Scourge.
Yeah, the scars got passed on as well. So it's like having, multiple layers of PTSD passed on to the next recipient. So they have to live with something they didn't necessarily experience personally, but they have the memories thereof. So it kind of began to fracture the shivalahala, which we'll get to in a minute or so. So because of all this, House Syrtis was a little slow to recover from the Scourge, and therefore they didn't have the resources and the whereabouts and the military capability to help out with the Theran War, first one. And so they kind of maintained a neutrality or a neutral stance about it, which didn't exactly make them friends with the Verulus clan.
Yeah, well, or with Thrall in general.
I mean, yeah, your river goes right north of the Thrall Mountains, and yeah, we're not going to help you a whole lot. But that's one of those things.
Yeah. House at Syrtis is sort of typified by this notion of various feuding noble houses amongst them and this supposedly great, long-standing historic aropagoi that was responsible for, like, they were the ones that were gifted the fire engine. All of this stuff that's going on, but is now this declining...
disarrayed.
Sort of squabbling. I mean, what it talks about in the book is that because of the mental damage that the shivalahala suffered, and through her inability to bring everybody together in the wake of the Scourge, the various foundations did not meet very often. And so there's a lot of everybody for themselves approach. It's very like petty, very potentially Game of Thrones kind of everybody for themselves. If you're looking for a much more sort of politically charged game or a lot of skullduggery and cloak and dagger and different houses and rivalries and stuff, that's what you'll find with House Syrtis in terms of a Tiskrang house. We kind of talked about Contention being this sort of enemy, antagonist, bad guy Tiskrang faction. House Vestrimen as sort of the counterpart to them of being a good guy faction, strongly allied with Thrall, strongly unified, a very powerful, probably the most powerful aropagoi, certainly from an economic standpoint, on the river network. House Syrtis being this once great house now in decline and squabbling amongst themselves and having issues with their leadership, not being able to wrangle everybody together. It is a near thing of there being foundations within House Syrtis that are more in line with the Theran objectives and the same ones that were involved in the raiding and piracy against Wormwood before the Scourge were accused by Thrall of working with Thera to try and find the underground river passage into Thrall that Vestrimen was using to get supplies to them. Syrtis as a whole not getting involved, sort of not really taking a stand or a position in the Thrall-Thera conflict. And just generally, like, they're in some ways a lot more complex politically, but also kind of not great because they're all sort of inward focused and selfish and squabbling amongst themselves when they had, at least in the past, according to legend, they had this great potential and were the first aropagoi and are in some ways kind of the fount from which the rest of Tiskrang culture sprung.
Had this...
The degree to which that is true, of course, is left up to yourself to decide. But that's sort of the image that they
had this importance and this significant portion of the culture that they contributed to. To Josh's point, it's the they helped develop, by gleaning the information from the dragons, how to survive the Scourge and hibernation. They were part of the reason that the entire Tiskrang culture has the fire engine, and only the Tiskrang have the fire engine. But yeah, they're in just absolute disarray because they are missing leadership at the top. And here's why. The current shivalahala was granted the shivalahala when she was 7. And sexless, that's crazy, because what if the shivalahala turns out to be a boy eventually, or male, because it's never been ruled by a male. Tiskrang are matriarchal society. And it's interesting because the 7-year-old, for the first time, seemed to be the most stable shivalahala compared to the last few, but still, that's a low bar to clear.
Yeah, so I think the shivalahala Syrtis is a fascinating character. Not just the
totally.
present day incarnation of her, but just the story. And I was flipping the pages and I found where you had the thought about dying multiple times. It's in the shivalahala Syrtis write-up, not in the history write-up. The shivalahala confronted each horror, each time surviving the confrontation just long enough to pass her ancestral memories on to a new one.
Potato, potato.
During the last of the 6 battles, a horror corrupted the shivalahala's warp astral space spell so that its effect remained permanent. Since that time, the results of magic have become unpredictable within 50 yards of the shivalahala Syrtis except for her own. That corruption also affected her traditional resistance to the aging process, usually bestowed during the initiation into the ancestral memories. Since that time, the resistance has been gradually eroding. The last shivalahala Syrtis, so prior to the current one, lived only 10 years after receiving the gift. The shivalahala Syrtis is also known as the prophetess and is very highly regarded amongst Tiskrang society at large, not just within House Syrtis. The pilgrimage route, which I don't know that we've actually talked about.
Geography thing. Yeah.
For another thing. There is this deeply spiritual pilgrimage route that runs from Ayodhya Hill near the shores of Lake Ban through a number of different shrines and cultural sites and whatnot along the shores of the Serpent River, ending at the Cliff City of House Syrtis. And those who complete the full pilgrimage and bring evidence of having done so, like you bring the ashes from the fire that you did at this blah, 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 are given an audience with the shivalahala. And it is known that King Varalus III actually did perform the pilgrimage and met with the shivalahala, but nobody knows what she told him, only that he emerged very, very angry, and that was it. My guess is that the shivalahala probably told him, perhaps cryptically, but told him of what was going to be coming down the line with regards to the arrival of the Triumph and his death and all of the sort of subsequent events that were going to take place over the next few years. That's my guess. That sort of makes the most sense, but nobody actually knows what was said. The current shivalahala Syrtis, at the time that the original Serpent River book was written, was a child, had not gone through Kaisa yet, and so had not expressed any kind of sexual characteristics. But also, it seems that this passing on of the ancestral memories to the child seems to have stabilized the problems that the shivalahalas had been having prior to that point. There is the concern, and different houses are, to greater or lesser extent, concerned with this in House Syrtis. What would be the case if the prophetess undergoes Kaisa and turns out to be male rather than female? Okay, so here's the thing. Within the time skip of 4th edition, the shivalahala Syrtis would have aged enough to undergo Kaisa. Right. We have not in anything published revealed what happened with that for a couple of reasons. The primary one is that I recognized when sort of thinking through these things that there is a very strong, it could be taken very strongly as a trans metaphor. I mean, not that that was intended when this was written back in 1995 necessarily, but today with a greater awareness of that, recognizing that there is something that could potentially be done with that in a representational way, in a way that I felt at least needed to be thought about, rather than just like going, oh yeah, the shivalahala Syrtis is female, everything's fine, whatever. But going, oh, well, what if the shivalahala Syrtis were male? What would that do? Like, what kind of blah, 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 blah. So it was also a situation where, like, I was not, and maybe to a certain extent still am not comfortable being the person that, not necessarily that would make that decision, but being the one to tell that story and what that could mean in terms of representation and stuff like that. And so I hadn't made a decision. All I will say at this point is that Morgan and I had our sort of brain trust brainstorming session at Gen Con, not this past year, but the year before. Yeah, in 2021, when Gen Con was held in September. And we've come up with an answer. Ask. I am not going to reveal what it is now.
Not on the air.
Yeah, and I wouldn't tell you if I did. But this ties into stuff that we are working on and haven't really announced yet in terms of future products. But Morgan and I came up with an answer that I am happy with and hope when we get to the point where that is being addressed within the setting
appropriately,
that it gets
I'm okay with that.
Handled
so
appropriately. And so within your own games, those of you playing along at home, you can make whatever decision you want with regards to the shivalahala Syrtis, and it is possible that the decision that you make will not agree with the one that sort of gets officially released later on. This leads me to another bit of trivia with regards to House Syrtis. When I was running sort of my first Earthdawn game back in the mid-90s, and this was before I got a copy of Serpent River. It might have been before it actually had been released, but it was certainly before I got a copy. I decided that I was going to base my game in a town that I made up called River Fork, which I decided to set at the junction of the Serpent River and the Kakavik River, because on the big poster map that came in the Barsave box set, that area looked like it had a kind of nice, like, sort of wide valley area that struck me as a good sort of semi-sheltered place that was connected to Greater Barsave, but was a small sort of area that I could develop as it was. So I came up with this town and all that. Then I picked up the Serpent River source book and discovered that the Lalai Gorge, this massive
we'll get there in a minute.
Grand Canyon-like thing, existed just south of where I had put that, and that there was a major Tiskrang town, city, capital right in that area. And of course, prior to the release of that book, there had not been anything that I had come across to indicate that sort of thing was the case. This sort of taught me the first lesson that, you may come up with stuff in your own game that ends up not agreeing with later published material, and that's okay. I mean, ultimately, I think the Lalai Gorge and the Cliff City and all of that stuff is really, really cool, and I'd use that going forward and have never returned to River Fork in any capacity. But that was sort of like my first lesson of, this can happen, and also recognizing how people might be reluctant to make a decision about something if they think that there's going to be an official answer forthcoming further down the road. Yeah, maybe, but are you going to put your game on hold until a book comes out that you might not see for a while? No, just make the decision and
I just think it's perfectly in line with why Josh got to be the line developer, because you had the same idea to put a city there, although yours was a small town. Someone else put a city there too. Just saying. They just built a bigger city.
That doesn't have anything to do. What has to do with how I ended up where I am is because I then spent the next 20 years living and breathing the setting and supporting it as a fan and working on it and all of that. But yes, like those early like creation
Just
bits
a wonderful
were the
coincidence,
first
that's all.
steps on the path that eventually led me there.
The shivalahala, as Josh said, is otherwise known as the prophetess, because she is revered for her exceptionally long memory, as all of the shivalahalas are. But she is the one who has insight into the future. So hence the story about King Virulus III going there to see what was going to become of his future and not being happy about it. But she herself, the shivalahala Syrtis, is a critical thread in Barsave's magical pattern because they've been around this long. But yes, even though the shivalahala got to be this way at age 7, has now aged the 10 years, they are aging normally, which is not usually the case for the shivalahala. So the warp astral spell, the horrors made permanent, is also doing that. So she's actually aging normally. Most shivalahalas tend to age incredibly slowly, and so therefore they live a very long life compared to most Tiskrang, because Tiskrang don't live all that long. I think 60, 55 years is like their average or something, or they're humans. Yeah. So
they've got roughly the same lifespan as humans.
Yeah, great. But the warp astral spell that the horrors made permanent on this shivalahala Syrtis is making them age as normal. So this also adds the wrinkle into whatever campaign you're doing that, yeah, if since we fast forward the timeline 10 years, they age 10 years. So so it's also not holding off puberty of the Kaisa for the shivalahala.
Right. There's a lot of potential stuff that you could do in terms of knock-on effects of that. You could say that the transmission becoming shivalahala did not stop the sort of normal maturation of the prophetess, but that perhaps after undergoing puberty, undergoing Kaisa, the aging process might slow at that point once they sort of reach adulthood. Mm-hmm. So that's one way that you could take it. You could take it the way you're talking about, that like, for whatever reason, they are aging normally, and that has potential long-term ramifications when it comes to what that means for House Syrtis going forward. It's possible you could actually have a campaign arc or focus of a campaign, one that may be sort of focused around House Syrtis if you want to run kind of a Tiskrang heavy game, to investigate, to go on the hunt for ancient magical lore and whatnot, to see if there is some way to mitigate or undo the damage that has been done to the shivalahala's pattern as a result of her struggles during the Scourge and what happened to the previous incarnations. That could be something where if you've got a Tiskrang member of House Syrtis, perhaps it's in the party, that could be looking at that as some way of perhaps starting the path of restoring the glories of the house or something along those lines. That's certainly something that you could focus on. You would have a game that probably would be, at least peripherally, be dealing with a lot of horrors and horror magic and researching into potentially deep, dark things involving nethermancers, maybe getting the Fellowship of Night, which we talked about quite a while back, involved as nethermancers that would have quite a bit of ancient lore and perhaps knowledge there, delving into Parlength to see if there's still knowledge or secrets that could be gleaned from the ruins there, perhaps dealing with purifiers or horror stalkers. I mean, there's a lot that you could potentially do around that, rather than just have the shivalahala be this distant figure. And of course, any groups that might be working on that would certainly need to prove themselves and navigate the internal politics of House Syrtis in order to gain a strong enough reputation to be allowed to get involved in something that potentially groundbreaking. Because if something goes wrong, I mean, as we'll discuss here with House Ticambris, in another episode or two of this series, if the shivalahala dies without passing on, they don't
exist anymore.
The memories, they're gone. That's it. They don't exist anymore. And so with the shivalahala Syrtis's situation being so precarious from a mental standpoint, that is something I imagine that is of great concern to the members of House Syrtis, particularly the higher ups.
They'll just have to fumble around like the rest of us
in
do,
general.
without, ages of wisdom to lean upon. But yeah, so speaking of what has happened with the shivalahala, since we're talking about the leadership vacuum that is taking place right now, because the shivalahala was underage when they became the shivalahala, and the fact that they are not literally, for House Syrtis at least, they are not anything other than the spiritual leader of House Syrtis. They don't have any political power. The Syrtis' hierarchy is ruled by its triumvirate, which involves the shivalahala, the admiral, and the chamberlain. Now, the admiral and the chamberlain are elected by the aropagoi's high chamber. The high chamber represents all 7 of the noble Nials. Now, the chamberlain has the power. There used to be 8. Now there's only 7. So the chamberlain has all the power.
There used to be 8,
levies the
but now
taxes
there are
on the
only 7.
Nials, prepares the budget, and occasionally skims some off for himself, because you do. But he has the sole power to call a resolution vote. So literally, he's kind of in charge. Well, she, whoever the chamberlain is kind of in charge. The admiral commands the fleet and maintains the peace among all the captains. So they're in charge of all the military.
They're like the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, commander-in-chief, because they take care of the military, that is the riverboats. They take care of the shipping, that is the riverboats, as well. But the admiral can't vote in the high chamber, but he also can't be censured. So they got to listen to him if they're going to speak at all.
The only thing the chamber can do if they're not happy is basically strip him of his title and
pretty much. We don't like you anymore. We're going to replace you. That's about it. So the shivalahala has no governing powers, but the high chamber is basically consisting of 3 representatives from each Nial, which is basically now, 3 times 7 is 21? And each of those is linked to a noble dynasty of Tiskrang. So there's your political maneuverings right there.
Yeah, so you've got these 7 noble houses. There were 8. The 8th, the one that is no longer there, was the Maratha Nial. They almost got completely wiped out by House Ishkarat. They were based out of Lake Vors, and then Ishkarat showed up and very nearly wiped them out. Only like 1 or 2 boats with a few survivors managed to escape, and as a result of that sort of shameful loss, the High Chamber said, we're stripping you of any position, and none of the members of your houses can ever become full Godonia in the house, and just basically cast them out. Again, another representation of how kind of shitty the internal politics of House Syrtis can be. One of the other things that's a little bit different with House Syrtis in that regard, at least among the noble houses, is that in most Tiskrang communities, the eggs are communally kept and hatched and raised. There's no sense of a specific egg being somebody's. You don't know as a Tiskrang who it was that laid the egg you hatched from.
Yeah, we're your DNA.
Your strong relationship is with the egg parent. What they call the egg parent?
Chida.
The Chida. Yes, thank you. That's the strong emotional sort of parental bond that is formed between Tiskrang.
Yeah, because that was a family function. You were ready to take care of that egg, so you hatched it and then raised that.
The noble houses of House Syrtis keep their own eggs. Like, they keep track of family trees, and there's a lot of...
They have a private hatchery.
Yeah, private hatcheries, and a lot of concern with, again, politics stuff. Like, the matings are, to produce what might be construed as good offspring, and
it's mostly
also for social status and political, again, very, in some ways, kind of
it's a caste
what we have is the stereotypically medieval caste system among the nobles and stuff like that.
Agreed.
And the fact that the Tiskrang birth rate, that is the number of eggs that actually successfully hatch, is kind of low and has been declining.
Yep.
Means that there is a potential for quite a bit of shame for those nobles who might be expected to carry on the dynasty of their line and not being able to do so. Again, classic, like, feuding noble houses importance of everything that you could deal with there. And so just like a lot of cool potential for social problems and politics and things along those lines. Having eggs be stolen from a hatchery so that you could potentially claim them as your own, and the classic sort of like baby swap kind of storyline thing where you trade good eggs for bad to try and end up in a good position and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. They have the private hatcheries to ensure lineage. They engage in arranged marriages to ensure social rank. And there's 5 ranks, which we are not going to get into because that is just a plate of spaghetti mess to unravel. Because all of this basically is leading to inbreeding.
Yeah, like long term, I mean...
never turns out well.
Look at the 18th and 19th century European...
And they've been doing this for centuries.
...nobility stuff that was going on.
So anyway, we talked about the last couple of houses and where their central house is located, just as a little geography point. And I think it's time we get to the Cliff City as well, because we're running short on time. But this is, to Josh's point, he made a city here. Somebody else built a bigger city on top of it. The Cliff City is basically at the bottom of a 3,000-foot gorge. So it's not quite as deep as the Grand Canyon, which is a mile deep. That's 5,200 and some odd feet. This is a 20-foot long, 3,000-foot
20 foot long?
In the cities on the south side. So 20 miles long.
Okay, I was going to say 20 feet. That's
I read feet on one thing and mixed up my numbers. So 3,000 feet
20
deep,
mile stretch
20 miles, 20 mile stretch. The city's on the south side, so really it will never actually see sunlight on top of it. So anybody who's on a balcony or a window in the Cliff City faces north, just so you know. This was a citadel, by the way, during the Scourge. It can, at one point, probably house up to 60,000 Tiskrang, and right now it's only currently holding about a tenth of that, so like 6,000 inhabitants. So it has the feel of a ghost town.
Yeah.
Kind of. A lot of unused space.
It's called out that many of the residents of the Cliff City, when the Scourge was approaching, returned to their home villages rather than be in the Cliff City. And given the strife and difficulties that House Syrtis has faced after the Scourge, they haven't really returned there. And so you've got this massive, gorgeous, ancient structure, ancient city that is just empty. Halls that have not seen name givers tread in them in decades, if not centuries, and dust. And you've got Parlength as kind of an example of a city that you can go delving into. The Cliff City could equally as well, like it's not as ruined or as corrupted, but there are large sections of that area that have not been visited, and who knows what kind of secrets or treasures could be located in them. I mean, in terms of adventure potential, House Syrtis is the most contained source of adventure potential between the politics and the feuding houses and all of that stuff going on, the House Syrtis and whatnot, that it's a very sort of internal in a way, and it doesn't have the broader Barsavian politic connections that Vestrimen or Ishkarat or Katenshin have, in terms of the reason that they're important is because of the alliances and connections that they have formed with various other powers over the years. House Syrtis is very kind of inward looking. There's so much that you could potentially do with that, and the potential for, again, if you want to run like a very strongly Tiskrang focused campaign, that you could do that with House Syrtis and not need to go outside of House Syrtis, broadly speaking, in order to do that. Agreed.
And we've hit the overview, the bird's eye view of this whole place. So when you approach House Syrtis, it kind of has to be on water. So as you're coming up on the river here, there's one period, by the way, where the spring floods make it almost unnavigable to go upstream. Downstream is like hitting rapids. So really dangerous. So for like a month, you can't quite get there. If you do, it's treacherous. However, the other 11 months of the year, when you come across the opening of the Great Cavern, it's 80 feet deep till you hit the baseline again. But as you enter this ginormous cavern, it has stalagmites of pink and blue, wooden piers for dozens of riverboats are in this cavern as well. So that's not exactly how it's, basically the size of like 2 or 3 football stadiums. Yeah. That's how big the cavern is, because huge. Riverboats are big and you can sit at least 40 of them along one pier, and there's multiple piers. So we're talking lots of them. And by the way, as you approach, the Syrtis dreadnought is permanently anchored just outside this opening. And when I ran an adventure for my group to come into the Cliff City from this area, I made sure to describe the dreadnought and all of these details as well to really paint the picture, because you have to. This is
the dreadnought is a massive, powerful battleship that is really expensive to operate and doesn't get used. It's almost like the Titanic in the sense of how...
It's kind of like the Queen Mary. It's still moored somewhere. It's pretty to look at, but it doesn't really go out on the water anymore.
Yeah. It is the result of a Tiskrang Questor of Upandal who basically went a little overboard in the inspiration from his passion.
Mm-hmm.
And basically designed it, and the council decided, this would be just the thing to help reassert our dominance of the river. Ran hugely over budget, took 20 years to build, 600 feet long, 250 feet wide, 8 decks, 3 paddle wheels, 4 separate fire engines, unprecedented speeds on its maiden voyage.
I know what this is. This is the aquatic version of the Spruce Goose.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what that is,
and then
young,
after its maiden voyage, the prince who designed it said, "I'm not satisfied," and went and tinkered and blew himself up with one of the fire engines. They replaced the fire engine, but have never been able to replicate the tuning, like the prince's ability to deal with it. And as a result, it just basically sits there in the cavern.
Mm-hmm.
The notion is that only a very high ranking Questor of Upandal in the throes of the passion would be able to successfully and somewhat efficiently move it. But it also just consumes so much true fire. It's like ridiculously expensive to operate. It's like yet another kind of sign of the fading decadence of House Syrtis when it comes to stuff. Again, they're just so cool.
Oh, yeah. There's so much to do in this place. And we haven't even hit the second floor yet, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So just above the Great Cavern, which, again, really huge, is the second level, known as the Hives. This is where the inhabitants are basically servants and workers. So people who work in the city have to go somewhere. This is where they live. And basically, it's called the Hives because of all the constant motion and chatter and noise that the servants and the workers actually make by going to and from where they live. So it's like bees buzzing ish. The third level is basically the main marketplace. So imagine living just below the hustle and bustle of a marketplace. Even though you're surrounded by rock, it shouldn't be a whole lot of noise. The main marketplace in the Hollow, this is called the Hollow, is 100 yards wide and sits 500 feet above the river on a balcony. If these visuals are not impressive enough for you, I'm sorry that you just aren't easily impressed. The fourth floor is the Trade Covenant quarters. So people who work in and above the Trade Covenants on the riverboats live here. The Crew Covenant quarters is the fifth level, and that's where the Navy and crew residents are. So all the merchants are the Trade Covenant quarters. I had those reversed. And then the upper levels, yes, there are more levels than that, because again, this is 3,000 feet deep. The upper levels are where the shivalahala, the High Chamber, the court, and all the residences of that court live in lavish lifestyle with a solarium, a theater, a library, you name it, all the amenities are there. Because again, this was a citadel during the Scourge. So it had to last 400 years or so, or longer, to house everybody like an enclosed city where you couldn't go anywhere. Best quarantine possible.
Yeah, and again, with the idea that the residents there were going to be hibernating during the bulk of that.
Agreed. Now, there's one thing on top. As you get to the top of this, because of course there has to be a stop, the cliffside, so where the land actually drops off the cliff face, there is what's known as the upper entrance. Now, this is Nathagi's Door. It is a grand stone arch, 70 feet tall. This is a 2,000-year-old monument, which, by the way, is weathering rather well because it's mostly made of true earth. But it sits literally on the edge of the cliff, so it literally is a doorway to nowhere. If you're on the ground and you go through the doorway, you will fall 3,000 feet into the water. You will probably not survive. But one of those things.
It has been used as an execution method in the past.
Fair. And during the Scourge, they actually hid the entrance because there is a entrance up there where you can come into the Cliff City from the top, but it's heavily guarded. It's also obscure to find. You really have to approach the entrance to the Cliff City from the water level in the river itself. But there are some other residents of the Cliff City, just to point it out for the last minute or so. The Obsidian of Zirabul.
Yeah, these are a mysterious group of Obsidian men. Nobody's sure how many there actually are because you don't generally see more than a couple at a time.
They repair the stonework around the city. They almost never speak.
Yeah. They live in the city. Apparently their life rock is
somewhere inside.
Somewhere inside or very near the Cliff City. And there's just a couple of paragraphs about them, and they are mysterious, and some suspect that there may actually only be the two of them.
I just find it interesting if you have an Obsidian in your party
beyond that
they occasionally disappear, come back after like a day or so, and will not speak of where they went. So they might just meet up with these Obsidian of Zirabul. Who knows? But Syrtis is operational. Again, they still dominate the river. They still function quite well. They're in a bit of disarray and probably on the decline, but who knows? Do with them what you will with all these points. But their main goal is to limit or turn back Ishkarat's expanding power. So they do have an oppositional force that they still have to reckon with.
Yes.
So I think this kind of wraps up House Syrtis, although we could probably spend 2 more episodes just talking about the intricacies of all kinds of things. But I think that's enough to give everybody to listen to and go, oh, we haven't tapped that. We need to go tap House Syrtis and draw on, what did we drop, like 2,000 threads here? 24 threads? One of those? Somewhere there?
Quite a few.
Yeah, so there's plenty here to go play around with. And I think, to Josh's point, Parlength and the Floating City are fantastic places to go, but I think the Cliff City is just as ripe for setting many, many adventures. Or if you haven't had your players go through or near the Cliff City, they are missing out. I think you can put a whole bunch of things going on in this place.
Yeah, one of the things that's really kind of cool about Barsave as a setting and the work that was done to develop it is the number of really interesting locations that were created for it, and how varied those are in a way, and fantastic, like in the sort of like literal sense of the term, in that they sort of express the scale and magic. You know, in the Fellowship of the Ring, the first of the Peter Jackson movies, there's that bit towards the end where they're sailing down the river, and there are those 2 enormous statues that they pass. Like, that's the kind of scope and scale that you get with stuff from Earthdawn. Parlength as this massive, ruined, abandoned city, the Cliff City, the Floating City, you know, on these reeds out in the middle of the lake, Thrall itself, Sky Point.
Yeah, there's this epic, and I do use the word epic, grandiosity to some things that are done, and I love it for that. And the Cliff City is no different, because there's even a color plate in the middle of the Serpent River sourcebook on the Lili of the Cliff City, and you're like, wow, yeah, that needed to be painted. That really did. And it still doesn't do it justice.
And that's up there with the House Contention, the House of 9 Diamonds, with these massive pillars rising up out of the river. A unique and very iconic kind of representation of
Hey,
things.
Don Higgins, as you're writing the graphic novel, put some of these visuals in there. Just saying. You can do it. Part 3. Just saying. For part 3. So, folks, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Tell us if you've used the Cliff City before. Tell us why you have not used the Cliff City before, if it was too daunting of a task for you. But otherwise, until next time, no, go visit the Cliff City for your legend.
Good night, everybody.